Back to another podcast here at Advanced Kayak Anglers podcast. I got a great episode tonight. I got two of the OGs, legends of our sport to talk about flipping and pitching and just kind of some general stuff like that. Let me bring them on for you right now. Without further ado, we have Kristine Fischer and Russ Snyders.
What's up, guys?
Thanks for coming on.
Hey, guys.
Kristine is a little sick tonight, so she might sound a little funny.
All good over here. Just a little head cold, hopefully.
So, pitching and flipping, guys. We're gonna go over the whole thing, and like, I feel like for me, it's like 90% of what I do. It's just like I look for stuff, and I pitch very small. I pitch a Texas rig though, so it's a little different than pitching like a jig and stuff. And there's different ways to do this. When did you guys start picking that up? Because for me, it was like one of the first things I learned fishing wise. So when did you guys start learning this stuff? You want to start, Kristine?
Yeah, mine's going to be pretty recent because, my bass fishing is not near as advanced as a lot of y'all have been doing it for a long time. I didn't start really truly, flipping and pitching in Nebraska. We didn't really have that wasn't something that a lot of people did. But I remember when I started traveling around the country, and I think the first tournament I really decided I need to learn how to do this was down in Texas. On Lake Fork, and there was a lot of matted grass. There was a lot of different cover that I wasn't used to, and overhanging brush on the banks and stuff. And I just had seen a lot of the guys on the Bassmaster Elites doing this flipping, a lot of pitching techniques. And I was like, I need to learn how to do this because this is how you get bit and this is how you catch big fish. So it probably, I would say maybe 7-8 years ago now is when I really started just doing a lot of it.
So obviously you picked it up and you've become great with it. I've seen you multiple times use that technique to cash some pretty big checks out there.
Yeah, I do it a lot now. It's probably one of I always have at least one or two or even 3 or 4 flipping and pitching setups on my kayak at all times for most all of my tournaments.
Russ, how about you?
I've been doing it for a while. I've been bass fishing since I was a teenager or so, and growing up in the California Delta and Clear Lake, where actually California Delta, interesting fact, was where the flipping technique was first created. It was D. Thomas. He's one of the first, old school bass fishermen. He just passed away a couple of years ago, but he spent his whole life bass fishing, especially out in the California Delta. They used to do it with really long, I think they were over 8-foot rods. They call it like tule dipping, where they just didn't have really even a reel, and they just would dip this long cane pole into the tules and pull them out. Then from there they made restrictions on the rods where it can only be 8 feet, and a technique that they'd use for flipping, where they grab the line with one hand and then kind of do this technique where you're holding the actual line and if you're right-handed, on your left hand. And I don't do a whole lot of that unless it's really close quarters fishing and the water's dirty. Most times I do pitching, which is where you just grab the bait and you have the rod, and usually you line it up somewhere right about where your reel is and just do an underhand cast. But I've been doing it since my days growing up out in California, and especially moving translates really well all over the country, especially the South or anywhere you have predominantly stained water and shallow cover.
Yeah.
It seems to be one of those techniques that you can, if you so choose, you could literally fish it anywhere. Because even when you can't see stuff, if I can find it on my fish finder, I still feel like I'm pitching to it. You know what I mean? Because I'll see something that's 3 feet under the water, and I'm still, I'm not really casting to it necessarily. I'm kind of pitching to it. So with these techniques, a lot of people like to throw punching in with it, and I feel like that's a whole separate world when you start talking about punching stuff, because the weights go way up. And
I think it's similar. It's just that, I mean, pitching is just the act of having like an underhand or sometimes even kind of like a backhand sidearm type of cast. Yeah. And
a lot of people get pitching and flipping confused
mm-hmm.
too. They'll call where you grab the bait and they'll call that flip, or they'll call that flipping, and it's actually just pitching. Or flipping, as Russ said, it is where you have the line and you're kind of real fast, close quarter.
You're pretty limited. Maybe 15 feet is about as long of a cast as you can make. You can get in and out of the water faster because you can pull the line with your hand to get that bait faster than it would be to reel.
It's more efficient if you're efficient with it.
But it has to be if it's really close quarters. It has to be an edge of a Thule line with like dirty water, and then you can
and you're just
drop it in a hole, drop it in a hole. So
that's actually one of my favorite ways to fish. Especially if I come up to like a lay down that has like a million little things I want to be in, I'll just get real close and I'll just grab that line and in one, out the other, just hit every hole and just run through them all. Just try to be as efficient with my time as possible. But that's one of those techniques, like you said, I feel like on a kayak, at least my experience with it on a kayak, I have to be like really close, like right on the stuff, like, because I can't get that. I'm not. I guess if I stood up more, I think
standing up definitely gives you a bigger advantage. If you're on a boat, especially, it's a lot easier. You just have more angles. You can do an underhand, like almost straight out in front of you. When you're standing up, just because you could drop that rod lower, just because of where I guess the butt of the rod is going to be when you're standing, it's higher, so you can get that rod more of an angle like that. In a kayak, if you're sitting down, it's hard to get straight, have that rod straight at you. So I kind of do it to this. What I end up doing is kind of like a backhand. It's not like completely to the side, but it's not right below me. It's kind of in that 45-degree angle from my backhand. And I'd say that's mostly how I pitch in a kayak, unless I'm standing up. But when I started kayak fishing, I'd stand up a lot more, but just because I was so used to it out of a bass boat. But as I've gotten more comfortable with it, I'd say 90% of the time I'm sitting down when I'm pitching and just doing more of like a backhand type pitch.
Now, a lot of the reasons I sit down so much for that technique is that, man, if you do hook into a really good fish, if you're standing up, it can be good and bad, right? Because you can pull the fish up out of the stuff that it's in, or you're not able to maneuver the kayak because you're standing up,
and it pulls you into the. That's the biggest thing, is it pulls you closer, so you lose your leverage.
Exactly. And then there's slack in your line for that split second. And, we've all had a few heartbreaks, I try to like minimize them as much as possible because they never feel good. So what kind of, what's your favorite rods for pitching and flipping? Kristine?
I've got a variety. Kind of depends on, really depends. I really like, a 7.5 heavy for me is a pretty versatile, kind of, what's probably one of my go-tos, a 7.5. And then I like a 7.3 for closer quarter stuff, 7.3 heavy. I like, I like having just a little bit more tip in a flip and stick. It helps that bait. Like, I don't know. I feel like I can be a little more accurate and I can skip it a little bit better, especially doing that kind of underhand skip. I've been working on that quite a bit. But I think I use a variety of different lengths, but probably my two most common would be like a 7.3. I sometimes even do it 7 foot. If I'm doing really, really tight quarter stuff, I'll go a little bit shorter, but I think a 7.3 and a 7.5 are probably my two just all around favorite go-to lengths. And then a heavy, sometimes I'll downsize and power to a medium heavy, a little bit lighter power rod, but those usually are my go-tos.
We're very similar. I got a little bit shorter rods, but I like to get into like the boat docks and stuff like that. I like around like a 7.1 or a 7 foot, a little bit shorter, so I can get a little more accuracy out of it. But we're very similar. What kind of line? This is to give some people some ideas who maybe are listening to this who haven't had a lot of experience or who are trying to dial in their flipping game.
Yeah, and line is something that it's so situational for me. I'll do anywhere from straight 20, 25 pound fluoro to 30 to 65 pound braid to then 30 to 65 pound braid with, or usually not 30 pound braid. Usually when I'm flipping 40 to
50.
65. Yeah. I've done 40 sometimes, but 40, 50, 65. And then sometimes even braid with a fluorocarbon leader, like a 20 pound fluoro leader. It really just depends, and it's situational on what baits I'm flipping, and then where water clarity, cover, how either vegetation or the brush or what have you.
So what would be the time you'd put that leader on? When would you go straight braid, and when would you go with a leader or fluorocarbon?
So honestly, Florida is big when I put a leader on, because that water, like up in the reeds, a lot of times it's tannic, but it's really, really clear. And I want the braid because that stuff is so thick and so nasty, but I do put a leader on because I think, you know, especially when I'm fishing lighter baits, because that bait's not going to fall as fast. It's less of a reaction bite and more of like, a lot of times down there, you're soaking a bait, a couple times where that fish will eat it. And I do feel like I get more bites when I do that and put that, when I'm wanting less reaction, fishing real clear water, but still want the power and the abrasion resistance that braid offers. Russ can probably elaborate on that a little bit too.
Yeah,
pretty
I'm
much.
really curious to hear Russ's setup now. Because now we got the benchmark, right? Me and you are very similar. So now, Russ,
Yeah.
what's your setup?
All that's pretty similar to the same type of things that I do. I use if I'm punching like with an ounce to ounce and a half and like really heavy grass and stuff, I'll usually just go 65 straight braid. If I'm pitching, I'd say what I'd use 75% of the time is 50-pound braid with a 20 or 25-pound fluorocarbon leader. If I'm fishing clear to stained water, around buckbrush or laydowns or reeds or most grass, and grass too, as long as it's less than like a 3/4 ounce and below. That's usually what I throw. And once in a while I'll go straight fluorocarbon too, if it's around a little bit lighter color cover, or if I'm like around skipping under docks or something like that, or if I'm wanting to do something where I'm not only pitching but also doing like roll casts. The thing with, if you use braid the leader, is I never want to use a leader where I'm casting. I'm using like about a 4.5 foot section to 5 foot section of leader. I never want to cast my knot out of my guide. I make it so that the knot is just past my tip, and then my lure is going to be about at my first guide is where I want my lure to be. And that gives me, from the guide to the reel, when I flip it, I usually grab the lure about even with the reel. But in case I reel it up a little too far, I'd hate to get that knot stuck in there. So I give myself a little bit of a leeway in case I roll it up a little too much.
Yeah.
But sometimes I'm not only flipping, but I'm also like wanting to do roll casts and stuff. And then I won't use a leader. I'll just use either straight 20 or 25-pound fluorocarbon.
I just want everyone listening, that little section that Russ just talked about on how to do it. If you're new to doing this, that is like exactly what you want to do. Every little piece of that, if you're new to this technique, is like perfect setup for it. And so we're all talking about the same stuff. We're all talking 7.5 heavy rods, sometimes a medium heavy if you're going lighter baits. Like I like
a little bit. You don't want a broomstick. Even on my punching rod with 65-pound braid, I use this iRod Gen 3. It's got the Bubs punching rod, but it's a 711. I have straight 65-pound braid, but it still has a pretty light tip. I use a 775 Air Series. It's probably my go-to. It's a 7.7, and then for closer quarters, I will use like a 7.3 to 7.5 sometimes if I'm like out on the river or something like that, or just doing a little bit, just closer quarters type stuff, or light flipping.
711, man. I feel like that's a really big rod.
That's what my punching rod is too, is a 711.
Just that extra weight, it gives you a little just a little more control and a little more. It makes it
Or
actually
just
just having that.
leverage too,
Yeah,
because
the
you're
hook
wrenching
set.
fish out of more.
For lifting the fish out. Oh,
Yeah.
I gotcha.
Hook set, really, really, really heavy cover. Just that little bit added length.
Yeah.
And it's usually for heavier bait. When I'm using that, it's for like an ounce and a
All the way
ounce
to
and a
2
half or
ounces.
so. Yeah.
And that's a heavy rod, right? You said
it's a heavy, but it still has a tip.
But it's punching rods are actually have more tip. I like more tip than flipping. They're supposed to, and that's because you don't. I mean, when you are kind of jacking a fish in that heavy a cover, if you have a rod that doesn't have that tip, there's people that blow their rods up. Like that happens punching. That's why it has to absorb all that shot. Exactly.
Yeah. Because you're not only just setting the hook on the fish, but then it's all that grass and all that cover and all that stuff that it's into. So you really need a lot of power.
It's got to be able to absorb all of that.
Yeah. And if you're on Gunnersville, that possibly could be a 5-pounder bigger fish really fighting you too with all that grass on. That's a lot of stress on there.
Yeah.
My punching game is lax, and that's probably why right there. My rod's a little short and it's a little too stiff on the tip. I was just thinking about the rod that I use for that, and I'm like, man, the tip is. I don't want to say it's a broomstick. It's a heavy.
Braid. If you're using straight fluorocarbon, I'll compensate by using a little heavier rod. You're not going to
stretch a tiny bit.
Yeah, it'll get stretched, especially with braid. You can get by using it with something a little softer.
So maybe putting on like 25-pound or not mono, but fluorocarbon.
Fluorocarbon on like a heavy rod, yeah.
And another thing to keep in mind with these techniques too, and we're talking about rods, is you really need to have a rod that's balanced really well when you're flipping heavier baits and punching, or you'll start to feel it like big time in your forearm. There's a lot. I used to fish a company that was very tip heavy, and I couldn't flip or punch all day because it would kill my forearm. Like having a rod that's because they think about it, you're making a lot of casts like that, and it's heavy weights, and
So do you switch hand? Because that's something do you switch hands back and forth after you flip and then switch to your reel hand, or is the rod in one hand? Because this is something I've had a lot of conversations with people about. Some people like to. What do you use?
Well, you and I have talked about this. So
I think so, yeah.
I flip with my right hand and I reel with my left. So the rod's always in my right hand. I'm always reeling with my left.
So I tried doing that because the advantage of doing that is you never take your hand off the reel. You're flipping it lands in. You're always going to be ready. You're always going to be prepared for that bite. But the downside of that is your forearm, if you're using a left-hand retrieve and your rod's in your right hand, your forearm never gets a break. And if you're flipping, especially like an ounce and a half weight, and just the energy to flip it and then to work it and then to flip it and then to work it, it's never getting a break. So it will wear your arm out. If you got like a, big forearm or something like that, a lot of guys, not a problem with it, but my arms aren't that big. I know hers aren't either. And it'll wear you out. But I use right-hand retrieve reels. But I'll cast with my right hand, I'll flip it in, and then I'll switch hands. But what's that doing is it's using energy on my right hand for the cast, and then I switch, and I'm using the left hand to work the bait. But by switching back and forth and having that little bit of rest between the cast and working the bait will definitely save your forearms. But it will, once in a while, you will be caught off guard, where as soon as you flip it in, it's sinking in as you're transferring the rod from one hand to the next, and you get that bite. Or sometimes you flip it in and it's still on your rod and it bites before you could switch your hand. So you really got to be quick, and there are circumstances where you can miss fish because of that. But I've seen it, done all ways, where people leave it in one hand and use the reel handle in the other hand, where they switch back and forth. And I've seen times where they just leave the rod in one hand all the time.
That's that constant debate, right? Because, you make more casts if you keep it in your right hand, but you get worn out, right? And I fish like Kristine myself, and I feel it too, man. Like my right wrist, I'm going to the chiropractor tomorrow. He knows that's like the first thing he's going to check on me is my wrist. He's going to get that all set up. so it's a real thing, and it's a balancing act. And the nice thing about fishing is there's no one right way to do this. Like you can do it either way, just like you're talking about. You can switch hands or not. So where would you say you would use this technique over something else? Because I feel like the areas that you use this technique, you could also use like a spinner bait or something else that you could throw into the heavy cover and bring out. And obviously, I would say this can be either a reaction bite or it can be a finesse bite, right? Like you can throw very small stuff and let them soak and kind of work them in and out of the cover, or you can throw things that move a lot and down, shoot them down with a heavier weight and bring them back up and move on. When would you use this over like a spinner bait? Like if you came up to lay downs, or when would you use this over some other baits? What makes you decide?
Let the fish tell you what they want, and that's the biggest thing. If usually you can, I know for me, like the conditions, it just starts to get to feel like you want to start flipping. Your bite slows down, the sun gets way up, and especially if you've got trees that a lot of times have like branches with a bunch of fresh leaves on them or stuff, and you want to flip, and fish are utilizing the shade. Usually first thing in the morning, I'm probably not flipping. But once that sun gets up or once the day kind of progresses, my bite slows down. I think, for all of us, it's just we're fishing the conditions, trying to stay fresh and letting the fish tell us what they want.
Yeah, I'd agree. That's pretty spot on.
Yeah.
With just the sun, especially the sun, like it's pretty rare. There's times where I'll flip first thing in the morning. But more times than not, it's like right around that like 9 o'clock time when the sun starts getting up, when I'm really starting to, that's when I really see that flip and bite start most times, once that sun starts getting up.
I don't know about you guys, but I actually look forward to that part of the day in the tournament, man. Like, because I'm just like you guys said, Kristine, you nailed it, right? You don't use it first thing in the morning, right? You're throwing, at least I am, and both you guys are throwing moving baits probably, or top water or something like that in the morning. But man, I really do kind of start looking forward to it when that sun starts popping up there and starts pointing straight down, especially if there's some docks or there's some obvious structure around that you can pop on over to. Because I feel like if I'm struggling with moving baits, I can guarantee I'll get a bite if I just work around structure long enough with it. So what are the popular size on the weights and baits? What are your favorite baits and weights and hooks? Like the terminal end of it, the terminal tackle side of it.
First, I guess we'll start with like 90-something% of the time I'm using a bobber stop to peg that weight. I don't know, I can't even really think of circumstances where I don't peg the weight these days. Sometimes if I do like a light Texas rig or something like that, where on like a little brush hog or on a bed or something, I'll have that weight sliding. But gonna peg the weight, use anything from a 1/4 ounce to 2 ounce, from little small baits, like I guess some of the mostly craw baits. I'll flip worms and stuff too, but I'd say at least 80% of the time I'm flipping some kind of craw, whether it's a beaver style bait, ultra vibe speed craw, a menace, a little Z craw. I don't know, what are some other ones? And sometimes I flip worms and stuff, like whether it be a speed worm or like a little ribbon tail worm,
Or like that bellows gill.
Yeah,
I flipped, so that's kind of a little extra thing to do there.
That's something a little different. Or even the gilly too. You can.
Yeah, the gilly. I flipped a gilly quite a bit before too, actually.
Yeah. Those are some of my go-to. Spicy beaver is another one, or rage craw. And it really depends on, I kind of separate it into 2 categories. Baits like a beaver or like a missile bait D-bomb or something like that, where it just kind of has like a slower kind of like the tails kind of sway like this, as opposed to, and I use that more in the colder water. There's times where it could work all year, but in colder water, I typically use those style baits, like a D-bomb or a beaver. And a little warmer water, I use something with like two tails that kick, like a speed craw or a menace.
A little more action and warmer water.
Yeah, and I'll go back and forth. There's times where sometimes in the morning, it's a little cooler and they're just a little more lethargic, and I'll start out with a beaver, and then it warms up, and then I'll switch over to something like a menace that swims more. But each bait, like typically earlier in the year, a really popular one, I'd say like pre-spawn around buckbrush or lay down somewhere in the Tennessee River. I use a lot of beavers with like a 5/16 is like one of my favorite weights. Yeah. Sometimes a quarter is just, it's a little just hard to cast, depending on the bait you're using, and it falls nice and slow, where 3/8 it almost falls too fast earlier in the year. And that 5/16 is really a sweet spot a lot of times when they want that slow fall. And as it gets later, I use a menace a lot, and like a 1/2 ounce, or a spicy beaver, like on a 3/4. If I want something with a little bigger profile, it moves pretty good. But yeah.
Any particular colors?
I mean, I keep it pretty simple. Like a green, if the water's clear, it's more like watermelons. It gets a little more stained. Green pumpkin. If it's muddy, black and blue. If it's not muddy but not stained, somewhere in between, I use like a 1/2 black and blue, 1/2 green pumpkin, or like a June bug green pumpkin. And if it's sunny, I use flake. If it's cloudy, I don't use flake. And it's pretty much, let's keep it pretty much to that and keep it pretty simple.
Yeah.
Like that. Kristine, you got anything to add to that? I mean, Russ
he pretty much covered it. I mean, that's I right in line with that 5. I was thinking the whole time like 5/16 is probably one of my absolute favorites.
Hooks too. You could talk about.
Oh yeah, so I like. I actually got into a heated debate with Terry Scroggins about this down in Florida a couple of weeks ago, and we went around and asked everybody about this. I love that owner jungle flipping hook. That's like one of my go-tos. And I usually use a 3, a 4, or 5/0. But Terry was swearing up and down about the spear point flipping hook. And
who makes that?
It's spear point hooks. I gotta remember. Yeah, I'll have to go back through my text, but there. So yeah, it was funny because we did a whole poll at the Toyota Owners Tournament with Mark Daniels and Ike Nelly and all these people, and it was like split. Those were
what did Mark Daniels use?
Owner jungle flipping hook.
Does he? Okay.
Yep.
He's he's from the Delta, and that guy's really
that's why I was like, Mark Daniels, like he and I are in that same. But Terry Scroggins was like, nope, y'all don't even understand.
I talked to Lucas, and I've seen Matt Allen talk about this too. And there's kind of a lot of pros and cons. I use a jungle flipping hook myself a lot, but there's some pros and cons to it. And I've been going to like an owner like a jungle EWG flipping hook, and see if I can explain this well. But I guess the one of the biggest advantages of the EWG is that hook point, like from the point to where it makes that first bend, is going to sit nice and flat on top of that hook. And when you skin hook it, it's going to come in and out of the cover a little bit better. Like that point is almost like buried in the bait, and it slide. If you're really having to fish around some thick grass or choice or stuff where you want to make sure when you lift it out, that point isn't going to catch. And another thing with it is when that bait, when you set the hook on the fish, all the bait has to do, I wish I had a thing, all the bait has to do is just slide down on that shaft. Where when you have a round bend, the point is kind of, if the bait's like this, the point's kind of going out at an angle like this. It has to come up. Yeah, and it wears out the plastic a little bit more. It's a little harder to really get that point to hide when you're coming in and out of cover. And the thing is where the point is, in order for that lure to slide down that round bend, it's actually, the plastic's actually having to stretch. It's having to pull a little bit to get past that round bend rather than just being able to slide down. And that little extra bit of energy that it takes to expose the hook and have that plastic slide down that round part, a lot of times I think you'll miss fish. Some fish, it's kind of 50. I'm going back and forth. It's nice because the hook points at a better angle, so when you set the hook, it's easier to get that point of the hook, but at the same time it takes a little more resistance to get that plastic out of the way than it does in EWG.
I love this, man. These are the nitty-gritty details right here, guys. If you're listening, right here are the nitty-gritty details. So I'm with you, Russ. I've been an EWG fan mostly because usually I'm my theory is always flipping the gnarliest stuff you find. You know, the stuff where no one else wants to throw, especially on tournaments where you're fishing behind other anglers or there's people in your area. You know, so I'm always reaching to the backs of stuff and then just putting it in the worst places. So I always kind of gravitated towards the EWG because it is just a little bit better in that heavy cover, getting it in and out. For sure. What kind of knots are you guys using to your hooks? You guys have a favorite knot to them? I know some people like to do a snell knot that kind of brings the hook point up, supposedly.
That's usually what I do, is a snell. Usually. Sometimes I get lazy and just do a polymer knot, but most of them I'm doing a snell.
I've been mixing it up myself and just trying to see what works. But at this point, I've gone back and forth, and at this point, if it's like half ounce and under, I'll just tie a regular, like a San Diego Jam is what I like, or a Palomar or whatever, you know. And if it's 3/4 and up, I use a snell knot, which will, when you put force on it, will kind of turn that hook. But I don't know. I'm not married to that idea of, I'm still kind of going back and forth trying to figure that out. But that's where I'm at this point.
So why are you doing it? Why do you do a snell knot over a certain weight?
What happens is if you do, more like on heavier weights, especially if I'm punching or something like that, if you do like a slack line hook set, that heavier weight, my theory is it hits the fish's mouth, and it's so much weight and so much force, it'll pop open that fish's mouth and the hook will come. So what I come out flying, you know, and not grab the fish. So what I end up doing more in the 3/4 ounce and above is I kind of reel tight. I make sure to kind of pull on it to get that weight on the fish's mouth and then pull up. I don't set on like a slack line. It's what I try to do with a snell knot. And with the smaller, lighter weights, I don't think that amount of weight, like popping their mouth, you know, hitting their mouth, is gonna pop their mouth open. So I do more of like a slack line hook set on like a half ounce or under.
Interesting. I had not thought of using two different knots for different weights. That's a good one, man. I'm gonna have to think about that one for a little bit there, Rush. You got me thinking on that. So we're covering a lot of this stuff really fast here. You guys are like some of the best guests I've had in a while. So when you guys show up and you have, Kristine, you said you have up to like 4 rods tied?
Yeah, there's sometimes I've had 4 flipping pitching rods.
Are they going to be different or the same?
Different weights, mostly. Different weights. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Different baits. I know you use punch skirts a little bit. Is there a time where you use punch skirts and times when you don't?
Ooh, that's a good one.
There's sometimes I like a punch skirt. I kind of experiment with that because Russ, you actually turned me on to the whole punch skirt thing a couple years ago, and I kind of been experimenting on my own to see when I like it and when I don't. And I honestly think I kind of like it in that, I don't know, not the real clear water, not the real dirty water, but just kind of like that cloudy water. I really like having a punch skirt for some reason. I'm not sure why.
Really clear water, I won't use a skirt. Sometimes, most times I use a punch skirt, but if I'm not getting bit on it, sometimes I'll take off the skirt and just use the bait. Like especially if I'm fishing like little river, you know, clear rivers or clear water, and just use, that's kind of how I do it.
So what's the idea of putting the skirt on? You know, a lot of people don't do that, and it's something that I don't do, and I've only thought about it occasionally, but I've never like.
Well, sometimes to me, like sometimes when I'm flipping, when I'm working a bait back, like I'll actually work it like a swim jig. And I like having sometimes I like having just a little bit more of that profile and that movement that a skirt can give. And, you know, I feel like I can kind of work that bait a certain way to kind of get a little bit more of a movement out of it with the skirt.
So a secondary kind of action to it.
Yeah, like a secondary, actually, that's exactly what.
So you're not using it to try to imitate anything. It's just on there solely for the adding that secondary action.
A lot of times bluegill, it gives more of a bluegill profile.
Yeah, like a bigger, kind of a larger profile to that. Yeah, like a bluegill brim. Certain colors in a punch skirt can kind of just make the whole bait just give off more of that, you know, brim look to it.
Seems to me that could be like a really good bedding bass situation.
I'll use a little punch skirt. Yeah, I'll use that a lot. It's just like a 1/2 ounce. It's like a menace or something like that on a punch skirt. I was using that in Hartwell last year. Caught a lot on it. Especially, well, a lot of times there's other baits I like for bedding fish, but sometimes I almost always have, you know, some sort of flipping bait usually with the punch skirt, and it's, you know, rarer, I'd say, when I'm solely bed fishing. A lot of times I'm just flipping or doing all kinds of fishing, and I come across a bed, and that's one of the just kind of easiest rods to grab to see, you know, where that bedding fish is at.
Let's say you're coming up to like a bunch of lily pads, like those lotus lily pads that are the real big ones. Are you guys going to punch that? Are you guys going to go through and put like a heavy weight on that? Are you going to, how would you approach
pads that? Or is there like hyacinth or stuff or hydrilla mixed in there?
Say pads.
Just straight pads?
Straight pads.
No,
big field of pads. You just come around a turn and it's like off to the side, and there's your big field of pads. Would you guys go and like how would you approach that?
I like a 3/8 in the pads. I have like a little swimming craw that I use. I feel like 1/2 ounce is a little too hard to like roll. You're gonna grab the pad stems and like pull them. And the 3/8 is like just heavy enough where you still have some good weight, but you can lift it over. It's going to fall into the hole. If it's like 5/16, sometimes if the pads are thick, it's a little hard to have enough weight to fall. And the 3/8 is about my favorite for fishing pads. It's not too intrusive where you can kind of swim it through without catching on those pad stems, and it still has enough weight to drop into some tighter holes.
And we were talking about this too. A lot of people, like, I always like to kind of work my way in. Like if you say you have a mat or you have pads, like a lot of people, they'll like flip right into the middle of it first. And if you do that and you hook something, you're kind of blowing out everything between you. Like there's been so many times where I'll catch fish like on the edge, and
or just reeling it back in, or just, you know, not even if you catch one, but if you reel the lure
back in, you're blowing it all out. So I always like to start on the edges and kind of work my way deeper into the pads, or, you know, the mats or whatever.
Or lay downs for that matter.
Or lay down.
Like a big lay down, you fish the tip first, and then just kind of work your way closer and closer towards the center. Another thing, we were talking a little earlier, and I might be hard to really explain, but I try to, there's like a zone that I really like when I'm flipping. I want to get as close as I can to the fish without spooking them, and the closer I can get, the more accurate, the more quiet cast that I'm gonna get. But a lot of times that varies depending on the water clarity. But I'd say like in stained water, you know, about 12 feet or so is like the distance. So from like 12 to maybe 17, I don't really want to make a flip longer than 20 feet away. So it's like this zone, like a 5-foot zone. And as I'm progressing forward down the bank, I'm just constantly looking. As soon as something gets in that zone, then I hit it. And I don't try to hit something too far. I'm just constantly, all my casts typically are always like the same, pretty much the same length. the one thing I'll say too about just technique with flipping, whether it's kind of, straight below you or a little bit sidearm, see if I can kind of explain this, is when I flip the bait, I'm gonna stop the bait on. So I'm gonna flip the bait, and when it's about a foot away from where I want it to land, I'm gonna have my rod at about 2 o'clock or 1:30. Not straight up, not straight point, not 3 o'clock, not straight pointed at it, but at about 2 o'clock, I'm gonna put my thumb on the spool and stop the bait, and then use my rod, and then slow the bait down with my rod right when it enters into the water. And that's how you'll get, the quietest cast. If you just flip it there and let it hit the water and then stop it, it's going to give a bigger splash. But you want to flip it, stop the bait with your thumb, and then use the rod to slow it down to get the lightest splash. And by the time you finish, you're just at about 3 o'clock with the rod.
That's so important. And I'm glad you said that, because when I teach, like at our women's events, when I teach these flip and pitching courses and we've got the cornhole board, I always, like, everyone's so fixated on getting that bait in that hole. And I say, ladies, more than anything, then you trying to get in that hole and be accurate, I don't want to hear that bait hit the board. Because I feel like how quiet you put that bait there is 1,000 times more important than getting it in that tiny area. I mean, you want to get that accuracy, that pinpoint accuracy. But I'm like, if you're flipping and it's going, that doesn't really.
It's better for it to be a foot away from where you're intending it to be a quiet presentation than to hit right where you're trying to cast, but it's like a big splash.
So I always tell my people that I'm teaching those classes to, I'm like, I don't care about that little hole in the middle. I don't want to hear that bait hit the board. I want you guys to work on that first. Aim for the board and just have it, just not even make a sound.
And it's amazing how quiet you can make it.
Yeah.
Like the difference is really stark. Like it can go from barely even making the sound of a splash to like a small cannon going off in the water. Super good point, man. Love that. So how long, like when you guys put it in, you don't let it soak? How long you guys let it soak when you throw it in? Like, what's your mentality around, or when you do let it soak, what is your mentality about why you're letting it soak versus punching it and ripping it out and moving on?
Again, that's going to go back to letting the fish absolutely tell you how they want it. I mean, I've had times where, and I discovered it because I'd flip in and I'd leave the rod there and go do something and not getting bit after a while. And then I'd go like either check my phone, see what time it was. And then it'd be like 10 seconds and I'd get a bite. There was a bite specifically on Lake Fork where those fish, you had to soak that bait for like 15, 20 seconds without moving it. And there's other times, and it's not just like soaking it. Then there's been times where like, I'll do so many different things. Like I'll bring the bait up to the very bottom of the mat and just shake it. Right. Especially if those fish are like popping up at the top, if you hear that a lot, like I'll bring the bait up to the very bottom of the mat and you can feel it like hit the bottom of it. And I'll sit there and just shake it like this. And I've had fish want to eat it like that. It really, you got to let the fishes tell you what they want. Sometimes they want it hot. Sometimes they'll hit it on the fall. Sometimes you got to soak it for 15 seconds.
On the bottom.
Shake it on
all
the bottom. Yeah.
This last tournament, Santee Cooper, we were fishing cypress trees, and I was flipping a Mag Fatty, just a big shake, 7-inch shaky head. And I was actually using my live scope in like these 3 to 4 foot trees. And they're fishing more offshore kind of isolated trees. And I just go from one tree. A lot of times I wouldn't cast until I go to about 4 or 5 different trees, and all of a sudden I'll see a tree. It'll have like 4 fish on it. But it's crazy how I'd have to cast it in there and just drag it on the bottom, just shake it and shake it. It'd be down there for like 30 seconds plus, or sometimes 4 or 5 casts. But I would, and then they'd pick it up off the bottom. And without the live scope, I wouldn't have had the patience to do that without knowing that they're there. But the most ideal thing is when they hit it on the fall. I love that, because then you don't have to waste any time, and you can, if they're hitting it on the fall, at least like 50% plus of the time, then I'll just let it get to the bottom, pop, reel, cast out, bottom, pop, reel. That's what I rather do. If they're, if they see it, they're going to hit it, and at least you give them that pop to go over and get to it. But sometimes, like on those cypress trees, like it would fall right by them on those cypress trees, and they would never. Oh, I mean, very, very rarely was I getting fish that were hitting it on the fall. They wanted to see it just shook on the bottom. So you got to let those fish tell you how they want it, and it's a lot of different variables that'll. Sometimes in the morning, they want to fish it slow, and then all of a sudden it heats up a little bit. They get a little more active, and then they start hitting it on the fall. But I'd prefer to spend make as many casts as possible if I can.
So I guess that's like one of the advantages of actually having live scope. It kind of does help tell you when you need to slow down and let it soak. It's like, you'll see the fish, you'll know that they're there.
Yeah, no, it really, that's about the only time with flipping that I'll use live scope. I don't, like in grass, I won't do it unless it's like an outside grass line or something like that, maybe, but not too much in laydowns, or maybe under docks. If I'm like flipping under docks or skipping under docks, you can kind of get a little bit of a better look. And again, it depends on how, like, I'm way more likely to use it if I'm having to sit there and soak it and it's just isolated little targets, as opposed to, if they're hitting it on the fall and there's a million cypress trees or bushes and stuff like that everywhere, I'm not going to have time to look at one at a time. I'm just going to hit it, pop it, hit the next one, and just keep moving pretty fast.
So when you're using this in grass, are you guys then upping the weight to become more like a punching type thing, or are you going to use it to fish grass edges and holes in the grass? Like, how are you using that technique when it comes to like a grass situation?
Her answer, she likes fishing grass more than me.
I do. Yes, Kurt, to answer your question, yes. I mean, for me, when I'm fishing grass, I like to try to, you want to get away with as light a weight as you can, at least when I'm fishing grass. So that's why a lot of times I'll have, 3 or 4 different rods or 3 or 4 different weights, so that if I'm fishing holes, I don't need a 3/8 half-ounce weight to fish holes. Sometimes I flip an 1/8 ounce in the holes. A lot of times I'll do an 1/8 or 3/16.
It's like a little speed worm or something.
Yep.
We're using it. Yeah.
Yep. Little speed worm. And or like a stick bait with a little tail spin on it, or something that I just want to fall real slow in the holes. I'll do that a lot. But then the edges, I can do a 5/16 if it's like real matted. Like if I'm literally pretty much punching or flipping matted hydrilla, you'll have to go up a little bit. But I always want to, for grass fishing, I always want to try to get away with as light as I can, still getting through.
Something to add to that, sometimes as light as you can even mean like an ounce or ounce and a quarter. Like sometimes I'm fishing really heavy matted stuff, and 2 ounce will get through it no problem. But I rather, as long as a 1 ounce, I'd say, as long as a good ratio, as long as I'm getting through, like if I'm talking about matted stuff, as long as I'm getting through on at least like 75% of my casts, like let's say there's matted vegetation, I'm throwing let's say I'm throwing a 3/4 ounce, and only 50% of the time it's getting through, I'm going to step it up to like a 1 ounce. And then if I can hit that, 75% of the time I'm getting through that matted stuff, that's about where I'm going to try to, like I said, I want to use the lightest one possible, even if it's a really heavy one like that, if that makes sense.
Oh, so that's a really good rule of thumb then for it, man. Just go as light as possible. That's what I just heard from both of you.
Yep.
Yeah, and there's different circumstances. Like there's times in the summertime when they want something a little faster, I'll throw that 1/2 ounce menace, where I could still throw a 1/4 or 5/16, but it's a little more of a reaction bite. The water is a little clearer. So there are times, where deeper grass or something like that, where I'll still put on little heavier, like a half or 3/4 ounce or something like that, just to get more of a reaction bite. And they just like something a little faster. But I'd say as a rule in general, most times I'm trying to use like lightest weight I can for the cover that I'm fishing.
I like that. I like that. Well, guys, we're kind of running towards the end of the show here. Is there anything that I forgot to bring up that you think is important for people to know about this?
I think we got it all. I don't know.
Covered a lot of good stuff there.
I mean, I feel like there is just like if you're not confident in this, all you have to do is listen and do what is in this episode, and you're going to be confident in a very short period of time.
Cool. I hope so.
I mean, you guys broke it down like, I mean, the best I've heard, I think, yet.
That's
cool.
Well, awesome, guys. I really appreciate you coming on. Here's your chance to thank anybody who makes fishing easier for you. Kristine, you want to start?
Honestly, I just want to thank everybody in our kayak community. I've got sponsors and all that, and they're wonderful, but I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I just really truly think we have something so special in our community, being able to talk openly about these techniques and always trying to help people out, help people be better at what they do and be better and catch more fish. And I just want to thank you guys, Kurt, you for having us on, and Russ for being just an awesome person and angler and always be willing to share everything you know, and everybody in our community, because I think it's really, really cool and really special, and it makes me just want to do it every day.
That's awesome.
Hard to say it better than that. I agree, and I'm thankful for just all our community. Everybody, I feel like we've been doing these tournaments for a little while now, and everybody's starting to get to know everybody even more. And it's really, especially this last year, it's been it's been a really good year, and I feel like everybody's it's been very little drama, and everybody's just in a good mood, and it's a good environment to be in, especially lately. And I'm just thankful for all the people I've met, doing these tournaments along the way, and the friendships that I've made. And it's something really special that I don't take for granted. I'm really grateful to be a part of it.
Well, guys, I'm super grateful that you guys came on. I mean, you guys are amazing guests, and you guys are like ambassadors to the sport. And sometimes I feel like people don't realize like it does matter to have good representation and good ambassadors in the sport. So thank you guys for that. And thank our listeners. You guys are part of the kayak family as well. Thank everybody. Please listen, share it. And thanks again, guys, for coming on.
Yeah, Kurt, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. Hope you feel better, Kristine.
Yeah, feel better.
I'm going to go. My nose is running like a sieve right now, so I'm going to go take care of that. Bye, guys.
See ya.